We are in the total cost of ownership. It is a 5-point series, a 5-part series. Yesterday we did part 1 and today is part 2. So I want to just take a quick poll and see who is here new today. So if you're new today, give me a new here or something in the chat box that says you're new. I want to just see how many. I see a couple of folks that are here that were here yesterday as well. So thank you for that. Excellent. Renee's new. Just one so far. Okay. All right. So I'm going to assume that Renee, you're our only new person this session. So I might go through a little bit faster some of the overview stuff that we have. So I work at the University of Texas at Austin. I've been doing TCO for many, many years with Doug Christensen. We've recently put together a APPA TCO standard. I was a co-lead on that, put together by 24 people. And some of the things that we're going to look at today are looking at the 13 principles. How can it make your organization more effective? Looking at the different levels of APPA TCO, basic, mid, and complex. And then document management, how that plays into it. And then outlining some next steps that we have through APPA. And so this whole program is outlined between what is TCO and then implementing TCO. And with that, there's a 5-part series. This is the second part. So yesterday we did an overview of APPA TCO. Second part of this is the elements of APPA TCO. So we're going to just quickly go through an overview of TCO to get our minds wrapped around TCO, and then as well as doing a deeper dive into the principles and then some supporting elements. Day 3, tomorrow, Wednesday, same time as today, 11 Eastern, we'll be looking at the implementation of APPA. And then our 4th session will be the same. And then our 5th session will be sort of an open environment where we really just talk about some Q&A and FAQs that we have with total cost of ownership. So in addition to learning about TCO, I'd appreciate it if you took an opportunity to let us know, is this a good format? Are we doing well? What would you like to see more of, less of, those types of things as we're developing these training programs for TCO? All right, so just to get our minds wrapped back around total cost of ownership, for those of you that were here yesterday, yes, it is a very lengthy definition, but like I said, we broke it down into 2 pieces. So the first of that's the summation. As we know, that's the summation of all those costs. There's 5 groups from cradle to grave, so to speak. The second part of that is to aid in our decision making. And so how do we use those data points to make decisions? How do we use even just the costing that might happen at a certain point? How do we use the costing for all of that to make a better decision wherever that asset lies within the asset life cycle? And so a good example of that is you've got this picture of some deer, beautiful, the sun setting, quite beautiful. But the bigger picture is that there's a fire. And if we take a look back at it's a little bit blurry as well, purposefully, on purpose, right? Just to sort of make a point that if you only have a little bit of the information, the decision you might make would be quite different than the decision you make if you have all the information. And that really is the essence of total cost of ownership. Having all the information and data and not just the few that we have. All right. So in terms of how we turn that data into decision making, I shared a story yesterday with you regarding how we take that data from our our electric bill and how we turn that into decision making. And so essentially it's saying, how do we turn those numbers into what kind of decisions we might be making? So good example of that as well. All right, I'm going fast on these and not repeating what I had yesterday because Renee's the only one who's shared with me that she's new today. So I just want to make sure if I do have more folks that are new, please let me know and I will happily go through that example again. But again, just want to kind of give a brief overview of what we talked about. And you guys are in presentations, and I want to just make sure our mind is back to total cost of ownership. All right, so here's where we get into the new stuff. So what are the key elements of total cost of ownership? And we're going to be looking at the principles that we have. So there are 13 principles, and they're grouped into 4 groups. The base of that, again, it's a triangle because we're building upon information to make decisions. The base of that is integrity. And then we move to foundation. So what are the assets? How are they stored? How are they classified? Then we gather information about those assets, and then we're making decisions about them for the better of our organization. We're going to go into how these kind of interact with each other for the rest of the session, and then also looking at how they play out into decisions and how they can be applicable. Oh, thank you, Van Hansen. Thanks for saying you're new today too. Welcome. So we'll be looking at these principles and then a little bit in more detail, and then how they play out into decisions that you can make in your organization. So you can kind of see the benefit of that. It's going to be an overview. And then tomorrow we'll really dive into how we can assess your organization and then how we can make that better for you as well. All right, so managed assets. It's the very first thing that you need to do, and it's one of the basic principles of total cost of ownership. What assets are you going to manage within this TCO environment? And so some of us, I work at UT, so we have multiple campuses across the state of Texas. And so we can manage those campuses, those buildings, but then we can also manage those systems and then those components. And what's great about total cost of ownership is we can even do this with just a vacuum pack that we have for our custodians. It can be one system, it can be one roof. So the decision here is, what asset are you going to manage? And then the second one is principle is, where are you going to store it? So our asset inventory is just where we're going to store it. It can be our major CMMS system. That this can also be just a back of a napkin. So where do you want to store the information? Don't recommend the back of the napkin, but that is something that can be used. The next 2 pieces are asset classification and asset location information. And this really comes into play if you're managing multiple assets. So asset classification, that can be uniformat, CSI, master format. Asset location, it can be it's in this building on this floor. Ideally, in a more complex system, we're looking at the latitude, longitude, GIS location for that asset. So it's basically at this point, what are our assets? Where are we housing it? And then how are we coding or categorizing those assets? So this really is the basis of how we start to manage assets. And I'll talk a little bit more about how these come into play as we build on the information that we house against these assets that we're choosing to track and to manage under a TCO environment. And I would say, even if you're not managing within it, or you think you're not managing within a TCO environment, I think there's still benefit to hold these principles even by themselves if you're not going to use all of them. All right. So this is where we start adding information to those assets. So you've got real estate procurement certifications, the insurance, the feasibility studies, the assessments that all went into the purchase of that asset. We also have master files. So master files can be BIM, they can be CAD, they can be the as-built for that particular asset. Also, tracking for total cost of ownership should be no surprise. This is where the first part of the definition comes into play. This is the cost. What are the costs, the maintenance, utilities, project, and other costs of that asset? We want to track all of that back to the asset. Then there's condition monitoring, and this is in the form of asset inspection. So this is where we might do an internal or external assessment of the asset. And then there's also asset performance, fault diagnostic, commissioning, energy, those types of things. And then we've got our project documentation that can be tied back to that asset. And then also our maintenance documentation that goes back to this. And so this is where and how, if you remember our discussion from yesterday, we talked about how an asset the information would travel from procurement or project delivery and then move into our maintenance arena. And so in this way, if an asset is housed in a place and it's tagged in a place, we can now assign and tag all these other pieces of information back to that asset. And that's what's key. So I'm going to ask a question here and answer in the chat box. Does this all need to be in the same system for total cost of ownership or for this type of data collection to work? Do we need one CMMS system? Do we need one asset management system? Or can it be multiple? So go ahead and since I'm not able to hear you, go ahead and put that in the chat box. I'll give you guys a few minutes. Does it need to be in the same system? No. Caitlin Weekly, thank you for that. And that's correct. Roz, exactly, no. Thank you. So the answer is no. It does not need to be in the same system. As long as when you say I'm going to manage this asset and you're tagging it, and as long as you're tagging it consistently within those other areas, you can have these pieces of information be in all disparate applications. The reason is technology has advanced so much that there's APIs, there's Tableau, there's ways to join and collect all of the information and data together. So really powerful to know that. At UT, just as an example, our real estate information and document is in a totally separate place. Costing is in our defined system. Don't tell anyone, but it's mainframe and it's a homegrown system. Our condition assessment is done by an external entity and they house our data in that space. Our project documents are housed in our famous environment. We're looking to upgrade that system. And then our maintenance documentation, that's housed in Meridian. And so right now, our challenge is we have the assets that we're managing, and we have set up these systems, but we haven't necessarily put them to where they're easily joined later. So at the time when we set up Famous, which was in 2001, when we set up VFA, which was in 2002, when we set up Define and Famous and all these other systems, we didn't really at that time know that we wanted all these pieces to talk. And so at this point in time, we're really looking to how do we create one version of that asset, meaning here's the asset name, here's how we're going to call it, we're going to assign a key to it, and then we're going to classify it in this way. And then that is then used all across those different applications. So we're in the process of trying to get these things accomplished. So I will tell you, you're in good company if you don't have these all in one system, but also that you don't have them all categorized where they're easily joined. So in some ways, when I'm managing our condition assessment data with our maintenance information to make some decisions. So for example, I'm saying, okay, this system is 10 years old and it should be replaced in another 10 years. How is that asset performing? I need to go to my maintenance, my work order system and say, is it tracking? Are we maintaining it how we should be maintaining it? But more importantly, are the costs of that high? Are we getting a lot of trouble tickets on that call? And then is that asset performing? Am I doing some fault diagnostic? And so there's 3 different areas. And right now I'm having to manually put those things together. That should be much easier. So that's a good example of how total cost of ownership can help sort of automate if you've got just the foundation. And remember that foundation is just as simple as what am I managing, where am I storing it, and what's the classification. So it does need those keys. Van Hansen asks, is it detrimental to keep everything housed together? Um, I think it depends on the environment. That is a great question. So my answer to that is it depends. And I'm happy for someone else to type in, and if they're doing this successfully where everything is together, to please chime in and help me answer this. But I do think it could be very beneficial that everything is housed in one place. Immediately I start to think of, well, what happens if that goes down? What happens if we no longer can maintain the cost of that one system? So now you have all your eggs in one basket. I don't know if that's enough to deter me from making that decision. At UT, I think we're just so big and our information is so much that it's hard for us to put all of that information into one place without having that join be there together. So Boss says not too feasible to house all together. Yeah, I would agree with that depending on the size of your entity as I just described. But I'm thinking about maybe a smaller um, university or organization. Let's think about your house, right? So I gave a house example last time. If you're tracking your house or maybe your portfolio of houses, maybe you have a couple houses, sure, I can see the benefit of having all of this in one system and tracking all of this there. But for most of us, we have multiple assets, and then we have systems and components, and then subcomponents that we may want to track. So it could be very, very not feasible to house all together. Um, Anybody else have any other examples or thoughts on that, on the housing together? If I'm not, seems like there might be a delay, so I'll come back to that if there is. So once you have all of this information organized and able to be visible to you as you're making decisions, what comes next is sort of the decision making. So you've got your design and construction standards that really play into how what's working and what's not working. So your design and construction standards should be a living and breathing document. As you're making exceptions to the design and construction standards, there should be an effort to track why, or do we need to change our design and construction standards based on what's happening within the real time of the asset. Another piece that we get from total cost of ownership from this are our financial reports. So annual or 5 or 10 or projected out even to 50-year financial reports. And then we also get asset decisions. An asset decision is really a means by communicating all across the organization what the decision is for that asset. So for example, I have a capital renewal program and I am looking at where to spend my very few limited dollars on campus. And so I have this really old roof. Roofs are easy, and you'll see that I'll use roofs quite a bit in my examples. And so it's time to do the roof, and it's the next in line for all the variables that I've put together. But little do I know that I have now, it was a decision by leadership to tear down that building and build new. And so if I don't have information about that asset and that decision, then I'm going to spend money on that roof to replace it. And then they're going to tear down that roof in 1 to 2 years. Whereas if I had known that, we probably would have patched that roof in areas, and it doesn't rain a whole lot in Austin, Texas. Occasionally it will. So then we could have mitigated that and not replaced the roof, knowing that it was going to come down. And in an organization as large as UT, that happens more often than I think any of us would like. So there was a joke that if we put a roof on it, then in the next year or two, it's coming down. So, all right, so that's asset decision, and that's why that's critical part of total cost of ownership. And then you've got your comprehensive plan. So what are our long range planning plans for those assets? And I liken that to planning in terms of also our what's happening with programmatic changes within the university. So coupling our information with what's aging, with also what's functionally failed with those entities, those departments, those organizations across your campus or your organization. So you can see how the principles are embedded here, the major ones, but we're missing our foundation principles. And that's where it's sort of an overlay. So I've kind of gone backwards here, whereas on the triangle before it was on the bottom. This is now the last. And so in order for total cost of ownership to work, there's a lot of data, there's a lot of information. One of my data analysts calls it JIJO, which is junk in and junk out. And so what's really critical to the successful implementation of total cost of ownership is really data management and verification. Someone who owns the data, someone who's responsible for the accuracy. That's where maybe a RACI diagram would come in. Who's responsible, who's accountable, who's contributing, who's it just informational for. There also has to be a process and then a culture of collaboration and transparency and of sharing and accessibility to that information. So as we've been talking about this at UT, there's information that UEM holds, and UEM is our Utilities, Energy, and Management Group. They hold information that's critical to operations that in projects. So utilities has really great drawings and maps of the infrastructure below ground. And so as we go about doing our projects, we need to know where those major piping and systems are. And utilities and energy management hold that information very close to them for good reason. One, we don't want the wrong people to have information to that, but two, they do a really great job of keeping up with that data. And if they gave us access to it, there's a risk that we could modify and change it. And so, as we've talked through this collaboration and transparency and sharing of data, we also have to think about putting in how do we manage that data so that it's viewable only and accessible to the right people at the right time, the right place. How do we make sure that we are able to do that, but also maintain the integrity of that data and integrity of that asset information? So it's something to think about. It's not impossible to do. We all should be able to share the information and data, most of it anyway. I'd say 95% of it, and in order to better help with this total cost of ownership um, implementation. Yesterday, I talked a little bit about the silos, right? So maintaining those silos, they're good, but sharing and making those walls invisible so that information exchanges, even at the lowest level of that silo, all the way up to the largest, that's where we want to be. All right. So going back to this is how these all interconnect and play together. I want to take just a quick moment to see if I've got any questions about anything on this slide. I've kind of gone through quite a bit. And unfortunately, I can't see you all to see if you're totally confused or if you are okay confused. So let me know if you have any questions so far about any of this. I'm not getting any yet. I'll keep talking. And if you have questions, I'll come back to them. All right, so in our APPA TCO standard, it's a two-part standard. I will be giving a code at the end of the presentation that will be available to you for a 10% discount through APPA of that. These shall statements are included in there and we've pulled them out for you. And on my slides, on each of them, we'll make these accessible to everyone as well. But there's a, down at the bottom, it says Part 1, Section 3.3. So I also share with you where this is found in our standard. So we pulled out each of these shall statements for you. And as we move through session 3 tomorrow and 4, we actually have created a chart that will help you analyze and see where you're at today and kind of give you a roadmap of where you're going in the future. So yeah, super exciting as we look at that. So I want to jump into giving you an example of the principles and how all of that I just showed you, how they play out in our organizations and in real life today. So these principles and APPA TCO, it's scalable. You can have small implementation, large, one or many basic or complex. And then it can be applied to new assets, existing assets, and then financials. So there's 3 ways we can use APPA TCO. And let's take a look at that. So let's jump into the new building and how these principles play out. So new building, it's super important to identify the costs that you're looking at for that new building, not just what it's costing you today, but also what it's going to cost you throughout its life. Gave you good examples yesterday in terms of the fountain. It was free So the cost of it, if we were just looking at our first cost, was absolutely free. But over the course of its lifetime, it's cost us quite a bit of money, and we need to account for those costs. With a new building, what's important to note here is that we can do this based on estimates. We can do this based on rule of thumb. So an easy way to do this for new building would be take your current replacement value um, as a campus as a whole, and that can be an estimate. And then you divide that by the square footage. Now you have a square footage cost for that new building that you can apply and extrapolate and say, here's what this new building would cost in terms of maintenance or repair based on percentages based on that current replacement value. So typically, renewal costs run about 3% of your current replacement value. And then your maintenance and operation costs, you can also take a percentage of your current replacement, or you can do an accumulated value for your maintenance costs across campus today, divide that by your square footage. Now you have a new building cost. A more complex way to do that, those are rule of thumbs, those are based on estimates, would be to go in to the systems that you're putting into the new building and generating actual costs. And I put actual in quotations because all of this is estimates. If it's new, you're estimating what it will cost in the future. But you can put in actual costs that you're seeing with systems in buildings similar to that building you're building today. So that's about as close as we would be able to get. And hopefully it would be on your campus. If you don't have those costs, you could certainly use a building from another place, maybe hopefully in the same state. And if not, it can be in a different state as well. But applying those multiplication factors can also be considered when you're looking at your new building costs as well. So is this a more complex? Is this a research intensive? UT, we have lots of research buildings. Some of the research buildings we've recently done have been extremely more complex, and maintaining those and the cost out are going to be much higher than anything we've ever seen. So making sure to account for those costs as well is something important. All right, next part of a new building and applying total cost of ownership. This is where standards come in. And it's just the essence of making sure that the asset that you're putting in there is the best asset for your campus, for your region, for the weather, for your maintenance to be most efficient. We have only 2 building automation systems within our campus. And the reason we do that is so that we can, we have the ability now to just maintain 2 versus maintaining a whole lot. So it's an effort to make our maintenance more efficient. And then aligning with our mission. This is extremely critical, I think, with the new building. And obviously, I think these needs get placed first before the long-term costs, but that has a play in this as well, and total cost of ownership aligns with that. So we saw this simplified version of sort of the asset moving from project delivery to maintenance and operations and recapitalization. And so really as a new building, we're sitting in that project delivery bucket. And so we want to make decisions based on what we're seeing on our other assets with our maintenance and operations and recapitalization, but then also making sure we're passing over that information to our maintenance and operations folks. So too often project managers get the glory of building the new building and then get all these awards and great things. They own that project for 1 or 2 years, maybe less than that. And then the maintenance and operations owns that building for the next 75 years or 50 or 25, however many years you want your asset to last. And so it's really critical that you start off on the right foot and pass over that information um, in as accurately and as validated as possible. Right. So we'll move on to an existing asset. And I've got a little exercise for us in here that we typically do by table, but you'll do individually. Shouldn't be too hard. I've done some of the math for you. All right, so we're going to look at an existing asset and we'll look at a roof system. So when we're doing existing assets, we're looking at our past costs plus our future costs. And we're using that to make a decision. Are we going to do nothing? Are we going to repair it, retrofit, renew, or replace it? And so our costing is really actuals versus predicting what our future cost is. So if we look at that, we've got an asset, 20 years right there, and say we're in the 5th year. So we have our first cost, and then we have our reoccurring costs. So those are both estimated and actual. Why do I say estimated if they've already happened? Right? So these can be estimated or actual. Great thing about total cost of ownership is it doesn't have to be precise if you don't have it. So estimated would be if this asset, you don't have it tracked to the cost assigned just to this asset, you can then take all of your assets and do a square footage or linear foot or a number of assets to get to an estimated cost of what it's costing you for that 5 years. So doesn't have to be always actual. You can use your estimated as well. Your future costs are then predictive. And so they're estimated based on our estimates again, or our actuals. And I say actuals here because you might have a system that is same application, same type of building, and you've got some good actuals of how that asset played out in the future. And so looking at our past costs plus our future costs, we then make those decisions to do nothing, to repair, replace, retrofit, or renew. So here's where we're going to do a quick just ask of you. So if you have this roof and it's 7 years old and its life cycle is typically 20 years old, and so far you've spent $10,500 on maintenance and retrofit costs over a 7-year period, and that equates to $1,500 a year, which is more than our $500 a year that we originally anticipated. So we're spending $1,000 more a year than the 500. So those costs are anticipated to continue at that rate. So yearly 1,500 until the roof is replaced. So if we do nothing, we're going to have, instead of 500 a year, we're actually going to have 1,500 a year, and we're going to replace that in year 20. Huge amount of risk, right? Or we can replace the roof. So in year 8, we could replace it. We're in year 7, so next year, and it would cost us $20,000, and that would get us back to our $500 a year maintenance. And to repair the roof, we're just going to patch it. It would cost us $5,000 in year 8. And you would assume that you would replace the roof in year 20 as we originally scheduled. So our maintenance costs would return to the 500 a year. So I'm going to pop over to this slide, but I'm going to come back to the one that we just had. So I set this up, and normally I'd have printouts for you on the tables for your table to discuss this. But so here's how an easy way map this out. So you've got your years along the line there. You've got replace at life cycle, replace at year 8, repair today. The first 7 years, they were all the same, right? So years 8 through 20, those rows below that, that's where that plays out to be a little bit differently. So on your replace at life cycle, which is basically do nothing, you would just repeat that 1,500 all the way down till year 20, and then put in that $20,000 cost for that route. Replace at year 8, we'd put a $20,000 cost at year 8, and then $500 a year, and then we would sum that to see what that equaled. And then for repair, we do in year 8 that $5,000 with the $500 at the bottom. And so I want to ask you right now, what do you think you should do? If this was at your organization, would you do nothing? Would you replace it? Or would you repair it? I'm going to pop back to the other slide just so that you can see that set up again if you need it. Pop back here that way you have some. So 1, do you have questions? Or 2, what do you think you would do? Do nothing, replace, repair. Go ahead and put that in the chat. And we'll see how many of you get this. So do nothing, replace, and repair. What is your guess? And you don't even have to do the exercise if you don't want to. You were just to guess based on just some maybe common knowledge. If you had this come out to you, what would you do? Do nothing, replace, or repair? So Cecil says repair. Great. David says repair. Caitlin says repair. If you have a question, feel free to ask. If not, repair, replace, or do nothing. Ronald says repair. Good. So if we take a look at it and we map it out, so if we replace repair to protect content, Alfred says, and Van Hansen says guessing, but he'd repair it as it seems it would cost less. Okay. And then the estimated costs, Jay Bohmeyer says of maintenance is $500 a year, which is 2.5% of the replacement cost. Is this estimate valid? It is probably not valid, but it's just a good example for an exercise, good for easy math sometimes. So yeah, probably not a good valid. Okay, so if we look at the numbers and we map it out, so if we do nothing and we replace it when we're supposed to, we're at 48,500. If we replace the roof in year 8, that's the cheapest option at 36,500. And if we repair today, remember that's the 5,000, that's the 41,000 that we're going to do. And so the cheapest option is for us to replace the roof. But if you sat in my presentation yesterday in the first one, is that always the correct answer, the cheapest option? Is the cheapest option to replace it always the best answer? The answer is no. It sometimes can be, if you replace it, don't you restart the 20-year cycle? Yes, you do. You absolutely do restart the 20-year cycle, which is why in year 20, we're not replacing it again as well. And so Ronald, you're making a great point, because if we were to map this out to 30 or 40 years, we might have a different cost calculation than we've done. As I've presented this um, um, across the nation, I've had somebody go out a couple years and they were like, actually, it's cheaper to do this over the life of it if you're looking at it from a 40 to 50-year time period. So yeah, Chris, that's a great, or Ronald, that's a great question there. And then Chris, that is the only reason this works out to replace. Yes. And the whole point of this simple exercise is that y'all are bringing up really great points and exactly the questions that I want you to be answering, because it's not just the summation of costs over some period of time. Um, the extension of that period needs to be taken into consideration. I just did this at 20 years, but really for the betterment, we really potentially need to be looking at the life of the building itself, not just the life of the roof. How long do we want that building to last that this roof is on? And then how far do we need to extrapolate those numbers? So yes, excellent. Another consideration I want you to think about is that roof, you heard me say this yesterday, might be over my office or it might be over the president's office, right? And we may not have funding. And in this example, if it is to replace it in year 8, that is the cheapest option. We may not have the funding for it, even if it's in the president's office. So we may not be able to do it in year 8, right? So we may only be able to repair. We've got $5,000, so we may only be able to repair it today. So budget is a huge consideration, and how that plays out within the mission of the university also plays out. So it's not just cost, which is, if I go all the way back to my first slide, which showed you the definition of total cost of ownership, and why it's so long is because it's not just about adding costs together. It's about using so much more than just the cost to make these decisions. And as you know, we've got so many variables, politics, the squeaky wheel, all of those things that would play into these decisions. So this was a simple exercise to hopefully get you thinking about, yes, it is about these costs and we should consider that, not just make a decision on what it is today, but definitely to look out and see um, what other variables come into play so that you're making the best decision for the organization. All right, Boz, annualized replacement cost and bring back to net present value. Yes, somebody brought it up. I appreciate that. So yes, this is also something that's missing. So that $20,000, it's not going to cost us $20,000 in year 20 if it's going to cost us $20,000 in year 8. That never happens, right? So that is another thing to consider as well. All of those things have to be annualized. There has to be some kind of inflation value on that as well. And then bringing that back to net present value is important too. One thing I'll share with you, communication to leadership as you're distributing this information is critical. So I was presenting to the president and also the provost at the time, and the provost at the time was an economics major. And so I love math, I love statistics, all those things. So I knew that I could kind of speak to his language, but nonetheless, I went out into the world of the internet and Google and tried to make my presentation speak to the provost, because I knew to some degree, based on conversations I'd had with the CFO, that the president was supportive of the program. But my job in this meeting was really to get the provost to be in alignment and kind of be supportive of the program. So I make this presentation all about, charts and numbers and graphs and correlation and so that he could see, the relationship of this. And so what I did was on the slides, I was so excited about what I had presented. What I didn't realize was that I'd chosen an inflation value that wasn't in alignment with the provost, what he had been using. And so my inflation value, the rate, my yearly rate of that it was off. I can't even remember what it was. But we spent like like 30 minutes of my presentation talking about that inflation rate. And so for a while there, I just learned to leave it off. So I share that story just to say, it's critical as you're communicating up how you got to the decision that you got to, but also understanding, the audience and who you're going to. So if you think that they'll argue for the 30 minutes of what that inflation value should be, either leave it off or say, hey, I can change it right now and reprocess this part. So just a fun little side note. So thanks for that, Boz. Really great. All right, so the existing assets. So we've looked at new assets, super important not to just do the cheapest thing today, because may not last very long. Looking at our existing asset with our roof, you can see how taking that information and data as it's coming in, as it's live in real time, how we can use that to make decisions on when we should replace that roof, the just-in-time decision making, right? And then taking a look at, was that application of that roof maybe not the best for our environment, and changing that for our standards. So that's how both we can use it for new and then our existing assets. So any questions so far before we go into financials? I won't pause too far, but pop those in if you do. So our last application of these principles and how total cost of ownership can help is through financials. So reporting, we can report out in so many different ways, and we can do predictive analysis. And there's 4 pieces of information that you need. That's it to do reporting, to do predictive analysis. And one of those is the system name. So there they are: system name, system cost, system age, system life cycle. And with those 4 key pieces of information, you can now do predictive analysis at your university and do budgeting, do financial reports with those 4 pieces of information. How does that work? So predictive modeling, there's the system name, roof 1, roof 2. That's how we identify that they're different. And then we have our current replacement value. One is $1 million, one is $2 million, and then the age. It's brand new, so it's zero age for roof 1, and it has a life cycle of 20. Roof 2 is 10, and it has a life cycle of 20. And so right then and there, we can create a graph that says, here's when we're going to need the money in terms of our budget and analysis. I don't put maintenance on here. I'm missing maintenance, right? So total cost of ownership is all costs. We assume maintenance is going to be steady year over year with some spikes or some increasing as it gets to that year 10. But you could also map that as well in a different color. But this is where our major spikes come into play, and how we might want to get additional funding for our university. This is how we would do that. I'll share with you, I started at UT in 2009, and using this simple principle of when stuff is due. So we have our assets. We do hire someone to do a condition assessment. It costs us roughly 10 to 11 cents a square foot, and we do a fifth of the campus every year. And so I get all this information. I get these systems, and I get when they're due. And in 2009, we were getting $14 million at that time. Today, we get 41 million a year. But in 2009, the way that I did that was I used this information and data to make this case of when we needed the funding and then what the risk was to our university, which wasn't hard because at the time we had 60% of the HVACs on our campus were past its useful life. 60%. 60% of those that were 40 years or older are HVAC systems. So I was able to use this data, this predictive modeling to say, hey, here's how much money I need. Here's why I have a huge backlog. And here's the risk to the university. So I was able to give them charts like this 30-year predicted annual cost. This was one of our campuses, not the main one. I then was able to give them this map of our campus. And this one was the most powerful. Pictures speak a thousand words. This one was the most powerful. So everything that's colored had an HVAC system in it that was past its useful life. Everything that was colored, orange, yellow, and red. Everything in red indicated an HVAC was over 40 years old. Everything in orange was 30 to 39 years old, and in yellow, it was 30 to 35. So red, lots of red, and those are 40 years or older. If anybody can put in the chat, how long do HVACs normally last? How long do they normally last? It depends on who you ask, right? 25, 30 years. Those in reds on this graph were 40 years. And so with those key pieces of information, I was able to then generate these graphs and maps. And the key indicator here was one of those red, one of the bigger ones in our central campus. Provost was in the meeting again and said, I'm about to, Renee, thank you, 25 years, yes. I'm about to hire a top researcher that's going to bring millions to the university, and I'm putting them in a red building. And I said, yes, yes, you are. So there was a misalignment between mission and the ability of our campuses to mitigate risk for that researcher. We were putting them in with an HVAC. HVAC is not that important, but if you're on a research campus like we are, there's lots of requirements for temperature and air, humidity sometimes, cold rooms, all those types of things. So super important in terms of research as well. So those are great scalable examples of how total cost of ownership can really be used at your university to really make a difference. Any questions so far? All right. So supporting elements. Are there other key factors for success? And I've talked through some of them within this presentation so far. And there's a few that we've outlined within our APPA standard. And so what is your current organizational standing? Where are you in terms of total cost of ownership implementation? That's a key starting point. Next one is the alignment with the mission of the organization, university, institution, or agency. You just saw me give you a clear example of that. We also have that it's scalable, right? There's other factors for success. You don't have to implement all at once, all in, everything. This is definitely scalable. You can do it on one roof, like I've shown you. What is the time and effort to value of TCO? And this is in direct correlation to how scalable it is. So just as an example, you don't want to stop everything and put all this effort into implementing total cost of ownership if the time and effort exceeds the value of total cost of ownership. So it's important to understand, if you're what you're working with in your current organizational standing and understanding how to make baby steps without purchasing anything new, without doing anything different, except building upon the greatness that you're already doing. How do we just now infuse a little total cost of ownership to make your organization better? With that, there has to be transparent information flow and exchange. We talked about that with our graphical depiction of how all these things come together. Total cost of ownership must be adopted by leadership and embraced by the organization. And there has to be someone that's championing that, whether that's the executive leadership or someone at the organization. Someone has to be championing those things. With the transparent information flow and exchange, there has to be that management system or systems, as we've talked about, that collect and distribute that information. But you also have to way to join all that information back together. There also has to be a fiscal and organizational decisions and assumptions. So what I mean by assumption is we're not going to have all the knowledge that upper leadership has or doesn't have. So there are some assumptions that we're going to have to make in order to make asset decisions about some of these things. So we may not ever be totally in the know when that building is going to be demolished. But there's also some assumptions that we can make in terms of how we're making decisions with total cost of ownership. So all of these are also outlined in our standard as well, really flushed out and discussed. And we'll be going over these in more detail in 3 and 4 as well, and how they apply. So we've talked about what is total cost of ownership in our first session. We're now starting to move into our implementing total cost of ownership in our session 3 tomorrow and 4, to be able to learn all of these great things about how we can help you better your organization. And so as a recap, on our third section there, the implementation of APPA TCO, we're really going to start talking about how you can do this at your organization. I'll talk a little bit about some of the areas we've been successful at UT and really going into that in a little more depth, but also putting the principles into play in terms of how you can do something by understanding first your maturity level. That's where we are. I want to make sure I've left some time for some questions, or maybe to go back over a slide, or go back through anything or re-explain anything that you want to talk about. So I'm going to open it up now for any questions or comments or things that you want to see tomorrow, anything. So let me know. Or I may have answered all of your questions. I'm not sure. If we were in real time in our virtual setting, I'd ask, what are some great restaurants to go to tonight, or good happy hours that y'all been to? I'll ask about other sessions. Good to go to, what I should pop into. I'm not seeing any questions. I wanted to leave ample time for you guys to ask them. Okay, here Brady says, what's a good starting point if you have nothing in place? That is an excellent question, Brady. So we're going to really get into that starting tomorrow and then in our 4th session. But just as a quick answer to that, a good starting point is really to look at the principles And of course, I've got to give you some documentation, and we'll do that yesterday to see where you're at right now. So the best starting point is figuring out where you are right now. And then the other easy answer to that is it depends, right? So I'll just share with you, do you start with new buildings or new assets, or do you start with your existing assets and try to implement total cost of ownership, right? So that's a good, what do I do? So at UT where I sit, I don't have as much visibility into the new construction or the new buildings that are happening on UT at the campus. I know before they're happening. I have the planning team that helps with that, with the, helping the deans brainstorm about all of that, and then we're hiring all those people. But I don't have the visibility into the money side of that as much as I do with the existing buildings. So on the new buildings, we're given a budget, and then we have to fit in to that budget. And of course, the donor or the college wants all of these things, and they want it as cheap as possible. And it's so difficult where I sit to make an impact on those new buildings. So for me, the good starting point is not going to be on the new buildings. For me, I actually control the funding, that $41 million. I control the funding of where we spend that money on next. And so for me, the easiest place to start and implement total cost of ownership is with the existing buildings. And understanding, my teams used to sit in maintenance, and now they live in project management. In the future, they may sit somewhere else. But I have access to those maintenance teams, the project management teams, and stakeholders across, like environmental health and safety, um, our fire prevention services teams. I have better access to those people to say, maintenance, where are your needs, EHS, where are your needs, and then collecting the data to now implement total cost of ownership in that way. So for me, it depends. In some organizations, it's much easier to do that with the new building, and start completely fresh and say, hey, we're building this new building. I know Doug Christensen at Brigham Young, it was much easier for them to do it on new buildings. So he was able to make a case that any new building that was built had along with it the money needed for the life of that building. So they would not build a new building unless they had the money. So build the new building, but they also had bonds or trust or whatever they had for that building set aside for that building as it moved through. What a concept. And that was done in the 1980s at Brigham Young. So that's a great example of, for him, how he was able to garner that support. Leo, you asked any suggestions on getting buy-in from I'm guessing upper management and leadership. And so I guess the biggest thing for me to share with you would say, um, speak to them in the terms that they know. So if all we do is we talk about systems failing, but our maintenance crew is doing such a good job of making them last and duct taping and sharpieing where we need them to go, we now have to shift and speak about things that would be impactful to them, in terms of the risk to their mission of what they're doing, and helping them to understand, if this system goes down, this is what happens. Um, And this is how that would be impactful to that researcher. We recently have a new AVP on campus, and he walks around campus and he says, "Oh, this is beautiful. I don't see that y'all have a very old campus. Y'all, things aren't failing, or they don't seem to be failing." And as we've lifted the cover, because we're really great at making things beautiful at UT, as we've lifted the covers for him and really given him awareness of what systems are failing and depicting the maps, those maps have been super powerful. I've then had pictures of some of those systems. And an old, ugly mechanical room doesn't mean anything to anybody until you start talking about, well, here's a picture of that. It's very rusty. What that means is this is how it's failing. So the quickest answer, Leo, to that is just align that back to the risk. What is the risk to the university if I don't do this? Ben Hansen, you asked, with all the work you did assessing the HVAC systems and presenting that info to others, did it help convince your university to fund the project? How hard is it to convince others to accept your data and assessment? Great question. Yes, I did present that information to others, and it did help us to fund that project. And so in 2009, we received 14 million a year, and that had been the case since 2001. So not more, not less, 14 million. And I started in January, and that whole summer for the next fiscal year budget, I just made a case for getting us all the slides or that map that I showed you, plus some other slides. I was able to get an additional $4 million solely for the HVAC. And so what I shared was I worked with the project management team and said, how much more work can you do without adding people if I get more money? So that's a consideration, right? So imagine, tripling your budget, but not having the staff to do it, or not even having campuses able to sustain that work, right? So you have to manage like, okay, if you are going to give me more money, what can I do without adding more staff? And that came to $4 million. We were able to do 2, maybe 3 HVACs at the time. And we picked buildings that were quick, easy wins. So at that time, when I showed all those graphs, I said, here's the issue, here's the sky's falling. But by the way, here's my solution. You give me $4 million, I do 2 or 3 HVACs in these buildings, and I show success. And so we did that. It was an achievable goal, and we were able to show success. And every year after that, I had to re-advocate for additional funding. And slowly over time, we were at 18 million for a few years. Then we got 21 million and 22 million. And then we jumped up to 41 million. And every year I've had to re-advocate for that. The past 3 years, I didn't, because I had them give me 41 million over 3 years and had that locked in stone. But I don't sit very high in the organization, so don't think I have lots of sway at my organization. I think the key part to this was I didn't do this alone. I did not do this alone. I definitely enlisted the help and collaboration and knowledge and expertise of others across our organization. So maintenance, project management, our large capital projects, environmental health and safety. I had someone on our budget committee come in and help create a prioritization process that was reliable. And then from there, when we allocated money, it was based on this prioritization process. And then there was a deliberate and reliable method to how we were going to do that. And then every year I showed, here's what we're doing to our facility condition index. Here's how it's going down. Here's how our here's where our money's going to. Here's the maintenance dollars that we're saving. So lots of photos, lots of, I guess, beating our own chest to say we did what we said we were going to do. Um, so that's part of it there too. How hard is it to convince others to accept your data and assessment? I think the more that I brought people in and made this a collaborative approach, the more traction I gained. And then my leadership was then supportive because they were hearing about it from their peers, of the good work that we were doing. So then that became an easy sell. And then they were then able to take that up the chain, to make a better impact, that I wasn't able to do at that level. So great questions. Yes. And so Billy's sharing that just in case the audio is not working, we hope that you can join us tomorrow at this time for the TCO Model 3. And I have shared with you the part 1 and part 2 codes here for the 10% off. And then if you're doing both of the part 1 and 2, there's the code for 10% off for the TCO model that's there. So yes, I do hope to see you tomorrow and answer more of these questions in depth as we kind of walk into how do we implement this. So super excited about that, and hope to see you tomorrow. With that, I think I've given you a little bit of time back, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, everyone.